Welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a TechCom community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn. You choose the topics, and we find the experts. In the TC Dojo open session today, we have Clarence Cromwell.
Clarence is a technical writer at Synopsys. He is also one of those people who works hard in his community. He's been an SDC chapter president, in the TC Dojo open session today, currently organizes for Write the Docs in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's a voice I listen to when I'm looking for ideas and talking about trends. And I'm grateful he could be here in the dojo with us today. Now, Clarence says to save your questions until the end, but be sure to type them in when you think of them so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. All right, I will stop the share, pass it to you, and it will be all yours.
Okay.
Hit the share button.
Let's just get that. I was an STC chapter secretary. But
I knew you were an officer. You've always worked really, really hard.
let's see.
There's a green button in the bottom ribbon. You should be
Yep.
able.
Oh, I'm still, I was selecting a desktop. And
I see the.
you get to see the rough cut. Okay. Okay, so templates for API docs. So I'm going to mention that this information I'm presenting I developed in conjunction with the Good Docs project, which is an open source project for improving documentation. And templates are just one aspect of what they do, but it was sort of the first and biggest thing in the Good Docs project, and that's kind of my only involvement with them. So for maybe a year and a half, me and other people over there have been working on templates for documentation. So what I'm presenting is sort of my piece of that. So the first question, the best way to jump into this is the first question we said we would answer today, which is minimum viable documentation and what is that? And a really quick definition that I've started with is the least amount of documentation that will get the job done. And this is really interesting because not very much documentation, if you think about it, isn't that awesome. Because one of the biggest complaints people have about documentation is what's missing. So less isn't necessarily more. And if you think about it for very long, viable is sort of the key word. And you end up focusing on, well, what really makes documentation viable? What makes it work? And probably the best answer to that is helping people accomplish what they want to get done with the least amount of pain and frustration. And then once you focus on that, you realize how complicated it really is to have minimum viable documentation, because you have to really be helpful. So you have to know that you're helping users accomplish what they want to do, and that's not easy. And so moving in that direction, I kind of worked towards, as I worked on this project, worked towards an idealized definition of what minimum viable documentation should do and what it should accomplish. So, basically, what if 80% of your users don't have pain and frustration, and what if out of the rest, most everybody doesn't have very much pain and frustration? That's maybe better than a lot of documentation is why I go to this, and especially in the beginning when you're working on your documentation and maybe users aren't that happy. I think, when you're trying to get something off the ground, I think this is sort of like an attainable goal and something that we don't always hit, and it's kind of hard to do perfectly every time. If you've done a lot of documentation, you probably realize that a lot of the time we're not hitting this, right? So, and then the question is like, well, how do you do that, right? So I'm gonna jump cut to what the templates are, like the final product of the templates, and then explain how I got to these and how they're supposed to address this pain-free environment for users. This is very simple, and it might look familiar. These documents types might look familiar to people who've done a lot of documentation anyway. So I don't assume that people call these the same things I call them, or that everyone uses the same documents, or maybe I don't assume that everyone has a lot of experience. Maybe somebody is new and they just want to listen in. So I'm going to describe what these are, but you know, this is just sort of to get started. When I'm talking about an API reference, I mean the document that lists all your API endpoints in a service. So if your API is a collection of addresses where you can send a request and get a reply, that's an answer from the API service. Your reference is just a listing of all those addresses, all the commands you can send to them, and an explanation of the replies that you would get back from any one of those. And a quick start is a set of steps that tell you how to accomplish something, but specifically it's the one you use in the beginning when you start using the service. You want to know what it does, and you want to know how it works, and you want to get up to speed. And so it's a really quick set of steps saying, here's how to, probably starting with how to set up an account or authenticate or, you know, get into the service. Here's how to do the main thing that it does, you know, and get the results you want to get. A combination of here's how to begin using it, and let us show you what's great about it. And then the overview, which I don't know if as many people use, but I was sort of taught this was mandatory. Overview is just a one-pager that says, what does this service do? How does it work? Why would I want to use it? Sort of like, what's it for? It's like the so what question. Addressing the so what question is always handy. So these are the three types, and it's interesting that I ended up with these because I kind of got to these in two different ways, which is one reason I want to explain like what these are and why they're here. I have three of these, and the point is, like, I don't have just one, I don't have just the reference, and I don't have these three plus one more, because the path that we ended up exploring brought us to these three documents. So here's why. And sort of two different things pointed to these. So the first thing that happened is doing research into journal articles and some internet sites about what makes API documentation work. There's been plenty of research going back to even into the 80s and 90s about what makes APIs usable. What do developers hate about APIs and API documentation? What do they prefer to see? Different people look at this question from different angles, and so digging through that, I sort of compiled information about what are the pain points, what are the difficult parts of using documentation, going in the direction of, if we want to make the documentation painless, what areas do we focus on to eliminate most of the trouble? And so this is how the focus got to be, in the beginning, this is how the focus got to be on these three documents. Turns out that people will quit. So I always use the term quitters. You'll have quitters if you don't have a quick start. I think nobody ever talks about the lack of an API reference because it just wouldn't be possible. There's always is one. It's a question of quality. But I've seen APIs with no quick start, or you could also call it a tutorial. And I think you could lose, I might be pulling up the wrong number, it's something like a quarter or a third of potential users will just walk away if there's no quick start. And the overview has, it's maybe a smaller group, and I don't remember exactly the size, but say a significant number of people might not start if they can't see that explanation, because that group of people wants to really understand what they're dealing with before they commit time to jump in and do the nitty-gritty details. They want the big picture, or they're out. So these three document types sort of emerged from looking at research into like, what do people want and what do they not want? And then, so here's where it gets interesting. When I looked at these and I realized what I had, I knew this was the right thing. I knew this was the right set of documents, and that I had everything, because I realized that I have a reference topic, a task, and some conceptual information. And I thought back to when I was learning to be a technical writer in the certificate program at Berkeley Extension. And I learned that these three categories are sort of the three types of information that you classify things into and keep separate. So like on the first or second, evening of class, my professor walks into the classroom and she has tremendous stack of books that she's carrying like this. And she starts to put a book down in front of everybody, these giant thick books. And there's 20 or 30 students. And the book she puts in front of me is a cookbook. And we're all looking at cookbooks. And she says, the professor's was Joanna Bujas, who's my manager now. So she's great at teaching this. She says, okay, we're going to talk about documentation today, but we're going to start by looking at cookbooks. And it's a great analogy because a recipe is a set of steps that lets you accomplish something. When you read a good cookbook like The Joy of Cooking, which is like my favorite cookbook, there's an overview at the beginning of each chapter. There's a fabulous chapter on how to select cuts of meat, how to store them, and things like this. Same thing with produce. Same thing with baking. I'm not really the baker, but it's there. And so you have tasks, you have conceptual information, and there's a little bit of reference. I never used the reference. I had to go check my Joy of Cooking, but so I looked in the back yesterday as I was putting this all together. There's a really nice table about how long you need to blanch your vegetables for how many minutes, and depending on if you're steaming them or just blanching them quick to freeze them. And there was a nice table about how many pounds of fruit it takes to make a quart jar if you're canning fruit. And actually, like we were putting away pears just a little while ago, and I was thinking, wow, I could have used that, because then I would have known how many quart jars I was going to have of pears. And what I did is I just took down all the jars anyway. But so good stuff. So I guess the point is, this is a natural way of organizing information, not sort of like an artificial system foisted on us by DITA, because that's strongly associated with DITA. But when you're trying to explain to people how to do things, this is organic and natural to go reference, task, concept. Anyway, long and short of it, the dividing the information these three ways, separating it into these categories is effective, because when I'm in the quick start, the overview information and the reference information aren't mixed in. And when I'm looking for reference, I don't have steps mixed in or overview mixed in. They're not in the way. And at the same time, when I'm trying to find something, I can find it because I know where it is. And that's sort of the basic nuts and bolts of it. So on the information architecture level, having these three categories works. People don't quit, and they can find what they want because of what's there. And then there's a second level to these templates, where once you have the right documents, the content in these templates tells you some things about, there's kind of a bulleted checklist, and I'll have links to the templates later, but there's kind of a bulleted checklist to make sure that the templates describe, or that your documentation has everything it should have in it, and that it answers the right questions in the right way. And there's sort of a ton of findings that I sort of dredged up from research, but what I want to share, since time is limited and there are a lot of small points, I'll bring up the two most important content things that the templates point you to, because these are the things that people complain about the most. If you read through like journal articles or just read web pages about how to have good API documentation, here's what you're going to see. Two major things: have code examples that work, and have copious comments following after them to explain to people how to use the code examples. There are people who read your documentation and then try to follow it, or try to follow it from top to bottom, but that's one type of user. And then the other type of user is the cut and paste user, who see they look at your page and they think, oh, every code example is a step, so I'll just go cut, paste, cut, paste, cut, paste. And some people are just doers. They cut and paste, and if it doesn't work, then they go back and they expect some comments right under there to maybe explain why it might not be working. And if you want to address both kinds of users, you need to have very good code examples with lots of comments, with effective comments close after. And that sort of implies things outside of writing the document, like maybe testing it yourself. And maybe if you're going to cut and paste and work all the way through this process, maybe there's bigger things like, if this tool does something to a file, you need an example file, et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of larger than this, but general idea being that people can just use the examples and get the help that they need right there inside of that step, everything they need to complete the step. That's number one. Big area number two is the completeness of reference documentation. And I say this is a bigger deal than most people think, because anybody who either builds APIs or has worked on API documentation knows that when you list all your attributes, you're going to provide the same four pieces of information. This thing has a name, it has a data type, it has it's required or not, it has a description. And people will look at the checklist and say, yeah, but we know that. And Swagger generates this stuff. And the thing is, Swagger doesn't automatically generate a description, or people don't automatically write good descriptions. And when you have maybe hundreds of endpoints or hundreds of attributes, one thing that's out of place is kind of like a pothole on the Autobahn. So when people are going smoothly and they come to this pothole that completely stops their progress, they don't remember the 99 miles of smooth pavement. They remember the one thing that was, a shock to their progress. And the sort of the factor that when many people complain about documentation, it's just the incompleteness or not usableness of reference information. And for example, when you to go into more detail, when you're putting together a YAML file for Swagger documentation, your attributes will appear as you in the documentation as they're written. Things that are required will be required. In your YAML file, you're not required to render a description. Everything will happen. If you don't provide a description, or if you provide empty quotation marks, I think of those as the international symbol for, like, we'll get to this description later. But if you just have quotation marks there, the user won't know what to do, and they won't proceed past that point. There are places in Swagger, like the description of the service and description of a group of endpoints and the description of each attribute, where you sort of have to make sure that the user gets what they want. And like in the reference template, it calls for explaining what an attribute is for, when a person might actually want to use that attribute. And if there are, for example, if there are only a handful of acceptable values, what are they? And if there are only a handful of acceptable values, it should be clear in which situation do I use which one of those. The same thing goes for the request and the response. So in the response, this I've seen complaints on most every API I've looked at eventually. When users see the response, they want a description to tell them what it is so they know what they're supposed to use it for. And I've always seen at least one user saying, "What is this for? Why don't you tell me why you're giving this to me? What am I supposed to do with it?" So if you keep that in mind when you're looking at your API reference documentation, and keep in mind that people want that level of detail on every endpoint, every property and attribute. So 80 to 90% of happy users just have make sure you have all three of those documents. Provide working examples with comments, and be detailed about your reference documentation. And that's kind of the recipe to get there. I'm looking at my note cards because I didn't want to forget anything. So I'm going to distribute, or I hope Elizabeth is going to help me distribute a PDF of these afterwards, so that I have links to these 3 templates as they are. Actually, I could share one of these really quick if we have time on screen. I wanted to mention you can use these for new documentation, which is the context that that some people think of, or maybe everyone thinks of first. But using these templates for existing documentation, I think, is actually a much more needed and common case. Just for example, it seems like whenever you get the first technical writer on a project, or maybe just when you get on a project as a technical writer, there's never an overview. And frequently, once you dig into the project deep enough, you can make a big impact just by writing an overview to explain, what it is and why people might need to use it. And I wanted to mention that these 3 templates are minimum viable documentation, but they're not anywhere close to the maximum. So I know that, if you come onto a project and add a quick start and an overview, very soon you're going to be adding workflows after that, because there'll be other operations, like there'll be advanced things that users want to do, and it'll just go from there. But you frequently need to come onto a project that seems kind of mature and still add something to have the minimum. Or if you start a project, you'll have this in the beginning and it'll just grow from there. So it's not a rigid framework. It's just a set of guidelines. And this is the last slide. This is some links to the Good Docs project, where you can see these 3 templates and more templates for other kinds of projects. I don't know if I mentioned it, but you could contribute templates there. If you're doing something and you look for a template and you don't see one there, you can always try to build the template and contribute it. Get some people to work on the template with you. And all you have to do is go there and talk to the folks at the Good Docs project. They also have a Slack group, GitHub repo, and my GitHub repo is on here as well, because I have the original versions of these templates and some templates that I think are not shared with the Good Docs project yet. So I will hand it back over to you, Elizabeth, to see if we have any questions.
Now it's time to type in those questions if you haven't already. And while you do, here's a look at what's coming up. The TC Dojo Mastermind Groups are monthly driven member discussion groups where attendees present their specific challenges to a group of their peers in a confidential, supportive environment. A mastermind is a collaborative environment where everyone lends their experience to each other. They can get feedback and advice about topics on their mind in real time from others who've been in their shoes. It's been amazing to participate in and a lot of fun too. We have 3 going on right now. One is everything TechCom, data, topic-based authoring, the specifics of cross-references or graphics. The other 2 are product-focused on Windchill for IT and ArborText users. These sessions are not free. They're a way to guarantee commitment between the participants. You can sign up at the TC Dojo website at mastermind.tcdojo.org. We know sometimes magic is just having the time to collaborate with someone who's been where you are.
What about non-REST APIs? Good question.
Good question. These templates assume an HTTP REST API. I think for a non-HTTP API, I don't have a template for that, and you could certainly you'd be welcome to come and work on one at the Good Docs project. But I got nothing for you today.
All right. I've read my share of API docs, but in the long past now. All right, here we go. Just a comment. I'm a novice and want to facilitate moving API docs into our program. Thanks for doing that. Awesome. See, people love it. Here's one. Does your reference template assume all content is auto-generated? If not, how do you blend generated and writer-written content into the same doc? Great question.
That's interesting. Here's one thing I didn't explain. We call these templates, but you do not have to open them up and start writing inside that document or fill them in like a form. They're more like a checklist of what should be in the document. So I kind of open up my template over here and I open up a new document over here and start writing my content. You can paste that checklist into your document and kind of delete it as you go. So it's not a strictly template, like a form. So assuming, does it assume that everything is auto-generated? I think in that sense, it would work either way with auto-generated content or content that was author-generated, because the template prompts you to check that the right things are in there. I don't know how you would merge. It's a good question. I don't know how you would merge generated content with separate content written by an author. I know that, for example, if I were working with, or at least not in the same build, I think frequently Swagger docs are sort of alongside HTML generated by something else. But I know. So if you're working on Swagger docs and you want to add something, you want to add a description, you just go to the YAML config file and you have to add the description in there. And I might not have said this, but in my experience, if descriptions are missing, I'm never able to add them, because if someone needs to explain what an attribute does and it's not there, I don't know what it does. So what I do is I remind the engineers to write that which is perfect, because the YAML file is in their repo and they sort of maintain it. So I point out that they need to add that, and I also try to get them to give me access to the repo and make me an approver on the merge request. And then I can take a look and maybe copy edit, or maybe suggest like a good sort of format, or what would you call it, like a structure for descriptions. There's kind of a pattern where you start with a verb when you describe what the what the endpoint does, like returns blah 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 or something like that. And you can help a little bit by sort of making all of the descriptions consistent and copy editing them, but essentially, you want the engineers to write those in the YAML file for automated content.
For sure. I remember back in the day at Juniper, one of the writers had been invited by the engineering team to participate and add comments or add actual content into like log messages and API docs prep files. Mm-hmm. And getting that sort of status and acceptance from the engineering team is a big deal. Mm-hmm. It can be really useful. And I see we have another comment from someone that said blending two sources very carefully. It adds a level of complexity for sure. And yeah, it does for sure. Mm-hmm. All right, here's one. Speaking of request response examples, should we provide a successful as well as an error example every time? If so, the code samples turn lengthy. True, but always useful.
And I think in the reference, that's a good idea to know at least what HTTP error code you'll get back if it's not successful.
Yeah, always useful. Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. And the last one is, sometimes tasks need contextual information. For example, details of what the API is in order to understand how to use it. So separation isn't always the right answer, although mm-hmm. I do agree in separation of task and concept and reference topics.
Fair enough. I think that kind of defines what the dividing line is. If you can't do the task without getting that little bit of context, I think that's essentially the comments that you're talking about. After you say do this and show the example, the comments are kind of some conceptual or context information where you say, well, it's only going to work this way. But not the full overview where you say, it all started a long time ago, because people don't want that much. People don't want that much information when they're doing the steps.
Even though sometimes the engineers want to share that with them. Doesn't mean we do.
Yes.
All right. Awesome. That was great. Great press. Thanks so much. Thank you, Clarence. And I want to check out all the links. That's fabulous. And I think it's cool that you invited people to help work on this repo. That's it gives you a level of experience that can help you anyway, no matter mm-hmm. what, right?
It's been great to work on these because what happens is you end up spending a lot of time about how these should look. And that's kind of, it actually took a while to go from, 0 to where they are now, and talking to a lot of people about what the model should look like. There are definitely a lot of different ways you could organize these. And most of the benefits of this have been in arguing with people about what documentation really looks like and what templates are supposed to do. It actually has a lot of benefits. Democracy is messy and not the best way to do information architecture, but in the long run, you end up learning quite a lot.
Yeah. There we go. Yes, well worth it. Thank you, Clarence.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks for coming to the TC Dojo by Single Sourcing Solutions, where it's all about you. Subscribe to our mailing list at join.tcdojo.org. You'll get a link to this session, as well as announcements for future sessions, and a convenient link to the survey. Every month, we look at the survey results so we can go out and find experts willing to share their expertise. Why should we tell you what to learn? You should tell us. Vote now at survey.tcdojo.org. As always, the TC Dojo is our pleasure to host. If you need more personal help and want to speak to one of our TC Dojo Masters in Residence, just go to ask.tcdojo.org, where you can get your question answered and be on your way. Thanks again, and see you next time.